As Grant pointed out, euthanasia can be characterised as both murder and mercy. Mercy because it is seen to be done for compassionate reasons. Murder because under our laws, murder is culpable homicide, where the actor means to cause the death of the person being killed. So it is killing. Anywhere where euthanasia is lawful, we can accurately call it state-sanctioned killing, because that's precisely what it is. We can, of course, indulge in creating terms such as medically assisted dying, or aid in dying, or even dignity in dying, but this does not change the reality. That reality is that an act of euthanasia will normally be done by a doctor or a nurse, giving a patient a lethal injection with the intention to kill. But it's my life. I want to have the choice. We often hear that, don't we? It's a powerful statement, but we need to ask ultimately, is it true or is it simply a slogan? I'm all for choice, ladies and gentlemen, but whose choice would it be? It might seem somewhat glib to point out that, but nonetheless it is the reality, that the choice would not ultimately be yours or mine. It would in fact be the doctor's. A study published in the Journal of the Canadian Medical Association in 2010 found that 32% of euthanasia deaths in the Flanders region of Belgium occurred without request or consent. Researchers indicated that the decision to kill, with or without consent, was made 70.1% of the time because the person was comatose, 21.1% of the time because the person had dementia, and in 8.2% of those occasions the doctor deemed it too harmful to have a discussion with the patient. How is that about choice? How is that voluntary? How is it less harmful to kill someone than to have an albeit difficult conversation with them about their choices? In 2005, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study that found that there were 550 deaths in the Netherlands without explicit request or consent in that year. The 2010 figure is something like 500. Informed consent is an essential characteristic of us exercising our choice, but it was notably absent here. Now, we don't know whether these people would have chosen euthanasia if they had been asked. We cannot say, but we can say that others made the decision for them, and the choice was effectively denied them. A study published in the British Medical Journal in October 2010 also found that 47% of euthanasia deaths in the Flanders region of Belgium, once more, were not reported. We also know from the recent Dutch figures that approximately 20% of all euthanasia cases in that country are also not reported. What's going on here? In both countries, few, if any, doctors have ever been questioned or brought to heel over euthanasia cases. Why wouldn't a doctor report every time? Eric van Wijselijk from the Royal Dutch Society of Doctors lamented recently that, and I quote, "Euthanasia has become the central point of conversation between a doctor and the patient who is suffering, when it should be the last resort." Jose Pereira, a Canadian oncologist who spent some years working in the region, says that in the Netherlands, euthanasia has moved from being a measure of last resort to being one of early intervention. He says Belgium has followed suit. People's care options are being limited here by the existence of euthanasia as an alternative, perhaps, to good and proper care. Choice, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of euthanasia, is an illusion. Our laws need to deal with stark reality and not some dangerous utopian ideal. And what about this idea of safeguards? We're told that safeguards will ensure that no one is ever abused by the legislation or under the legislation. But is it realistic? And ultimately, do safeguards really work? I believe the short answer is no. Safeguards, Wesley Smith from the United States, a lawyer and an activist there, once said, are really only there to make legislators and all of us feel a little easier about passing laws for state-sanctioned killing. In 1998, the Parliament of Tasmania undertook an extensive study on euthanasia. This wasn't related to any particular bill, it was just a study that they took on themselves. 4 of the 5 members of Parliament who were elected to the panel were known to be pro-euthanasia at the beginning, yet in their final report they were unanimously against the proposition. To quote from one of their findings, the committee found that the codification of voluntary euthanasia legislation could not adequately provide the necessary safeguards against abuse. Now this echoes the British House of Lords report, the New York Task Force report, and any other number of parliamentary inquiries on the subject. But let me give you just one example of how these safeguards don't work. Most euthanasia bills, as Dr. Grantley pointed out here today, include the requirement that 2 doctors assess the patient against qualifying criteria and that they sign a document attesting to those factors. What do you think would happen if a doctor forgot to get the second colleague's opinion or forgot to submit the necessary paperwork, as clearly happens in the Netherlands and in Belgium? Would he or she be charged with murder? No, not likely. Possibly the only witness is dead, of course. But the doctor could simply claim to have overlooked the paperwork while claiming also that the necessary checks were indeed done. And that may well be true, but it might not be true. Who would ever know? At best, such a breach would probably be little more than a misdemeanor or a slap on the wrist. If anyone thinks seriously that doctors who go outside the law and ignore the safeguards are going to incriminate themselves in their reporting, then please see me afterwards. I've got a breach I think you might want to buy. But no doubt supporters of changing the law in New Zealand will say, well, you know, we'll make sure that doesn't happen here. And to be quite honest, those safeguards I saw that Grant had on the overhead there were probably the best I've ever seen. But I can still find that those safeguards are not effective. And then there is a slippery slope. I believe it does exist, and I'll try and prove why. In terms of euthanasia, it is represented by the inexorable move from euthanasia applying to a small section of the community, for example, the terminally ill, to making euthanasia available more readily, more broadly. In the Netherlands now, disabled newborns, teenagers, and even people who simply claim they're sick of living can be euthanized. The law has not changed, but so-called protocols and interpretations have. And if for some valid reason, or perhaps an invalid reason, your GP doesn't want to kill you, you can now find a mobile service that will bring death to your door. The Dutch Medical Association has also recently approved euthanasia for people with dementia and Alzheimer's, and even for loneliness. So much for euthanasia requiring consent and capacity. Choice here is being sacrificed for some other ideal. It may well be connected with compassion, but the choice certainly has disappeared. Just last week in Belgium, the Belgian Liberal Humanists Association declared that people with intellectual disabilities, all children and people with dementia, should be able to request euthanasia. In other words, those who have some diminished capacity for rational judgment, people easily steered, one might imagine, towards one decision or another. This is all an understandable progression of the euthanasia rights agenda, because once we say there's a human right to die by euthanasia, we cannot reasonably contain it to only a small section of the community. For human rights to be rights at all, they must have a universal application, and we're seeing that being worked out in the Netherlands now. A few years ago, Western Australian MP who tabled a bill there wrote to the local euthanasia activist group and said that he knew his bill wouldn't please everyone, but that it was a good start. A good start. And you know, that's exactly how any sensible activist would play for a change in the law. If they went for everything at once, for example, if they tabled a bill that looked just like what's happening in the Netherlands now, we know damn well it would be rejected. Better to appear to be more moderate and gain something of what you would want, because it's easier then perhaps to come back later and try to get more, or in the case of the Netherlands, to sideline the law entirely. Recently on Australian television, Philip Nitschke admitted that there might be opportunity for people to be coerced into accepting euthanasia. The CEO of the pro-euthanasia lobby in the UK, Sarah Watton, also said she had concerns about assisted suicide, how it would play out on vulnerable groups. Abuse clearly can and does happen. The Tasmanian inquiry also said the committee found that the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia would pose a serious threat to the more vulnerable members of society, and that the obligation of the state to protect all its members equally outweighs the individual's freedom to choose voluntary euthanasia. We could also consider, ladies and gentlemen, the phenomenon of elder abuse. Elder abuse is financial, emotional, physical and even sexual abuse of an older person, usually by a trusted friend, relative or carer. It's estimated that about 5% of people over the age of 65 will at some time experience some form of elder abuse. In the years ahead, we will be entering a time of the largest wealth transfer the world has ever seen, when the wealthiest generation on the planet begins to retire and move on. There is every possibility, I believe, that euthanasia-assisted suicide could provide a cover for the ultimate in elder abuse. A wise man once said, just in concluding, that before you move to pull down a fence, first find out why someone chose to put it there in the first place. Our laws make perfect sense, ladies and gentlemen. They are a fence that protects all its citizens equally. There is no doubt that issues around death and dying really do need to be discussed in depth, and we're not very good at that. But we really need to honour our elders, protect and support vulnerable people by daring to work towards a society that somehow rediscovers caring in a new and profound way. These questions are hard ones, but euthanasia and assisted suicide